to our webinar on understanding intergenerational trauma and intergenerational healing, recovery, resilience, and wellness. My name is Cyril Cromwell, and I will be hosting this session with our special guest, Nene Kwasi Kafele. We've had a great deal of interest in this webinar, and we're welcoming over 200 guests that are joining us right now, and I'm sure that many will join us as we move forward. We want to start with a land acknowledgement. So YouthREX's provincial office is located at York University. So both YouthREX and York University acknowledge its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Toronto has been taken care of by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Wendat, and the Métis. It is now home to many Indigenous peoples. We acknowledge the current treaty holders and the Mississauga of the New Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. This acknowledgement was composed by the Center for Aboriginal Student Services of York University. So there are just a few things to keep in mind. We want to make sure that we are letting everybody know that this is going to be recorded so that they can have access to this content in the future, and those that are not able to join us today can check it out later. It's going to be uploaded to the YouthREX website, and you'll be able to access it through the exchange. If you have any trouble with the audio quality, please try calling in on your phone instead of using the computer audio. When you are using that panel on the right side of the screen and you see audio, as soon as you click phone call, the phone number, all that information is going to be showing up for you. If you have a question, we really want to hear from you, so comment as well. There is a window on the right side of the screen where you can type in your question or comment, and we're going to be taking these up throughout the conversation. We'll definitely do a pause in the middle as well to make sure that we can hear back from those of you that are joining us today. You can also keep the conversation going on social media. Our Twitter handle is Rex4Youth. Very briefly, I want to talk a little bit about YouthREX and what makes opportunities like this possible. So our vision is an Ontario where shared knowledge is transformed into positive impact for all young people. And our mission is to make research, evidence, and evaluation practices accessible and relevant to Ontario's grassroots youth sector. And that's done through knowledge mobilization. And I'll show you what that looks like: knowledge mobilization, capacity building, and supporting evaluation. But we're also looking forward to supporting program design and development. So I want to now introduce Nene Kwasi Kafele, who is an educator, a social justice and youth advocate, a researcher, a community organizer. He has a passion for working and organizing with young people. He has extensive planning and leadership expertise in the areas of the youth life cycle training, which is like the rites of passage, and youth leadership, community economic development, anti-oppression, community development, strategic planning. He has held senior positions at CAMH, that's the Centre for Addictions and Mental Health in Toronto, and in the Ontario provincial government. He was also the executive director for the Jamaican Canadian Association, which is actually the largest African Canadian social service agency in the nation in Canada. He has wide teaching experience, particularly in the field of environmental studies at York University. And then he is also listed in Who's Who in Black Canada and is the founder of Tabono Institute, the only African Canadian research and public policy agency. He is a certified conflict mediator with a specialty in youth conflict. So we're gonna be hearing from Nene just about now. But if you want to read more about him, please make sure to visit youthrex.com and look out for our email that we're going to send up following this webinar, so you can get information on Nene as well as access to the recorded webinar. So I'm going to hand it over to Nene, and we're going to go into his presentation very shortly.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining this presentation on understanding intergenerational trauma and intergenerational healing, recovery, resilience, and wellness. Today's discussion will focus on contextualizing trauma, understanding the impact of trauma, promoting healing and resilience, and some concluding thoughts. I'm going to start by saying a few words about how we frame and contextualize these issues. We want to make sure that we understand some of the terminologies that we might use. Anti-oppressive practices are those that seek to focus on historical and systemic oppressive situations with a view towards addressing the oppression in some clear and effective ways. When we talk about social justice, we're talking about approaches that seek to address and rebalance the unequal distribution of social and economic justice in our society. And the work that we're focusing on, we talk about it being culturally grounded, that the community's cultural worldview, value systems, and practices are clearly central in any journey towards healing and wellness. Asset focus is another term you'll hear quite often in the presentation. And it is to ensure that we have a balanced perspective around communities that are traumatized. We don't see them as problems. We see them as having problems that are caused primarily by social inequities. And that they are sites of historical resistance, bravery, resilience, and defiance to oppression. They're not victims, survivors. Racism is another term that you'll hear often in the presentation, and we define it as the abusive use of power to reinforce an ideology, value system, and worldview of racial hierarchy through dehumanizing, persistently negative and oppressive systemic experiences against racialized and Aboriginal peoples. And racial terrorism is the frightening use of state and state-sanctioned force, harassment, surveillance, violence, and death. For example, the historical and contemporary murders and lynchings of African Americans and Jews by groups like the Ku Klux Klan. So trauma, how do we define trauma? Individual trauma results from an event, a series of events, or set of circumstances that are experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or threatening. It has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. Trauma manifests behaviorally as a set of conscious and unconscious actions and behaviors. Psychological trauma is an emotional state of discomfort and stress resulting from memories of an extraordinary, catastrophic experience which shatters the survivor's sense of invulnerability to harm. What makes an experience traumatic? The experience involves a threat to one's physical and emotional well-being. It is usually overwhelming. It results in intense feelings of fear and lack of control. It leaves people feeling vulnerable and helpless. It changes the way people view themselves, the world, and others. An intergenerational trauma is a trauma transferred from the first generation of survivors of the direct experiences in the past to the second and further generations. Historical trauma is related to the emotionally devastating experiences of people when a major event or events is aimed at a particular group because of their status as an oppressed people. Examples include the Holocaust, enslavement of Africans, experiences of Aboriginal First Nations people in contact with Europeans, and colonization. Historical trauma has far-reaching effects. We're going to focus primarily on the Black and Aboriginal First Nation communities in talking about this reality of historical trauma. Historical trauma has morphed into a myriad of contemporary traumas. Structural and systemic racism have created cumulative trauma on its victims. Violence, for example, experienced in many of today's Black communities may include the way children are taught to behave, police shootings and community gang violence, early death and over-incarceration, lack of fairness and justice in the criminal justice system. Boys are parts of the effects and evolution of historical trauma. Other examples include systemic neglect of Black and racialized neighborhoods, a world of armed, violence-prone, delinquent gangs and peer groups, high levels of addictive drugs, infectious diseases, and easily available firearms. Some neighborhoods which resemble police states with constant surveillance and stress being the norm. For many Aboriginal or First Nations peoples, the experience of trauma, historical trauma, have been related to colonization. For example, the banning of indigenous languages, religious practices, tribal governments, and tribes or ethnic groups. Residential schools and removal and formal and informal removal from communities. Warfare, genocide, and disease. Some of the impact for Aboriginal and First Nations people include the loss of language and culture, disproportionately higher levels of peer, spousal, community, and state violence, substance abuse and alcoholism, chronic health issues including diabetes, mental health challenges, and depression, pervasive generalized poverty, generational poverty, and higher rates of suicide when compared to the national average. And here are some general indicators of historic and intergenerational trauma for both communities. Now, these do not define completely the kinds of experiences that result from these traumatic realities, but they cover a significant number. Depression, anger, psychic numbing, hypervigilance, and deep distrust of the state. So many, for example, refuse to take part in census data gathering or polling because of suspicion around what will happen with the information. Things like medical practices, research, where people have been used in the past. Both Aboriginal and Black communities have been used in secret experiments in the past. Fixation on trauma, somatization, deep anger, survivor guilt, victim identity, re-victimization by those in authority, fear of authority and intimacy, and domestic and lateral violence. Some generational impact include chronic or episodic family violence, physical, sexual, emotional, and or verbal, difficult or lack of healthy emotional bonding, denial of cultural heritage, identity confusion, racial discomfort. Many in those communities, for example, have difficulty and embarrassment and discomfort identifying culturally with those communities because of what they have been taught and told over generations that have been negative. Poor or irregular contact or the absence of contact with family. Extensive alcohol, drug abuse that crosses generations. And some indicators from the community, because historical trauma and intergenerational trauma have community impacts as well, not only on the individual and the family, but the larger Aboriginal or Black community. Unconcealed alcohol and drug abuse among contemporary community members, lack of coordinated and comprehensive cultural opportunities, language skills, history, traditional values, spirituality. Generally low levels of social engagement or social capital, trust, reciprocal helping relations, social engagement, for example, infighting, competition, potentially destructive patterns of engagement, examples of over-reliance on substances to escape psychological strain, for example. In terms of racism, racial terrorism, and systemic oppression, they compound and allow for the continued oppression of these communities, for example, through the media, economic structures, political, social, legal, and educational systems, child protective services. It reinforces the view that the world is an unsafe place for entire groups of people, and significantly shapes the lived experience of individuals within a cultural group. Post-traumatic slavery syndrome is one of the framing that has become quite relevant and quite significant in the Black community to explain the behaviors of many in the community as a result of the history, the devastating history of slavery and its compounding impact. Post-traumatic slavery syndrome is described as a devastating condition that exists as a consequence of centuries of chattel slavery of African people, followed by institutionalized racism, racial terrorism, and oppression. This has resulted in multi-generational adaptive behaviors. Some have been positive, demonstrating resilience and determination, and some have been harmful and destructive. Dr. Joy DeGruy, who is a well-known researcher and advocate of the analysis of post-traumatic slavery syndrome, describes it as Black infighting, materialism, poor parenting, jealousy, colorism, defeatism, frustration, rage. These dysfunctional, these negative behaviors, as well as many others, are in large part related to transgenerational adaptations associated with the past traumas of enslavement, colonization, and ongoing oppression. Generational traumatic oppression has a very concentrated nature in terms of how it physically and geographically impacts communities. For example, extreme concentration of poverty and underprivileged groups, so-called ghettos or reservations. Drugs having a devastating impact on Black and Aboriginal women and children in addition to men. People from the Black community, for example, are 20 times more likely to be incarcerated for similar drug-related arrests from the Caucasian community. Concentrated police presence in the inner city. And some of the impacts include freezing and dissociation, depression, emptiness, detachment, and difficulty defending self. The conscious or unconscious belief that things or people cannot change for the better, that Black or Aboriginal communities are automatic markers for problems. By not speaking up about inequities, a sense of resentment, shame, and self-blame is usually present. A lack of sense of personal agency, a loss of hope. A few cautions in talking about intergenerational and historical trauma. These do not fully explain the challenges of Black or Aboriginal communities. This type of trauma is a social determinant, part of a multiple array of other issues that should be considered in addressing challenges facing members of these communities. And trauma is a very Western notion. It is a language that is not fully culturally competent in terms of engaging people who have been victimized.
Thank you so much, Nene. That was absolutely incredible and very insightful. And I think now is a great time for us to just take a pause and reflect on some of the words that you shared, and also to remind people to send in questions, because we're going to be taking another pause at the end of this presentation to be able to reflect on what's been shared and to have more of a discussion, even with a specific case example that we've prepared. So please be prepared for that. I want to follow up really quickly on some of the things that you've said as well, because I'm seeing that we don't really have a lot of questions yet, but we have a great deal of interest. Right now, we have over 300 people that are in attendance, which is showing a great deal of interest in this topic, which is great. But now is the opportunity for us also to have conversations. So please, on the tab that's on the right of your screen, there is a section that says questions, and you can type your questions directly into that box, and they'll come right to us, and we will ask them to Nene. Since we have so much on the go, I'm going to keep things moving pretty quickly because we also want to take a poll, but I want to just, again, say thank you, Nene, for talking about the challenges of even conceptualizing the notion of trauma when living in a nation that is highly Eurocentric in terms of its education, its perspective. I know the term Maafa has been used as a Kiswahili term to talk about the great disaster and terrible occurrence. And I want to ask you about this, Nene, to speak to some of the challenges we have, not only in talking about trauma and talking about intergenerational trauma as a reality, but also like the language of how we even start to conceptualize where to begin with this. So, the timing is very interesting. On an international level, we have the Decade of People of African Ancestry. On a national level, the Truth and Reconciliation initiatives. On a provincial level, we now have the Ontario Black Youth Action Plan. And there are many initiatives in the city. So the timing is interesting. People or initiatives are trying to address some of these concerns. But my question then is, are these concerns effective? How much questioning do we have to do even about our approach in the first hand? So it's a loaded question, and I'm seeing some questions come in. I'm encouraging people to continue to send them in. But Nene, if you can speak to that just before we go to the poll.
Right. So thanks a lot, Cyril. That's a very heavy, meaty question, but I'll try to respond. First of all, the term Maafa literally means the disaster. It's a Kiswahili word that means the disaster. Another term that is becoming much more relevant and acceptable is Mengamazi. Mengamazi is the deliberate and persistent destruction of a thing or people. So Mengamazi, in the thinking of those who are promoting it, essentially defines the challenges of African people as with respect to slavery, enslavement, and so on, as not just a disaster, because a hurricane could be a disaster, an accidental thing that happens once in a while. But Mengamasi is the word that describes its deliberate, overt, intentional, persistent, organized, and comprehensive destruction, which gives it a stronger and more effective and focused definition of the challenges we face. And I agree, there have been a number of initiatives over the last while that focus on anti-Black racism and focus on Aboriginal First Nations justice. I think one of the key things, and this is more articulated in the Aboriginal experience, is the focus on history and the impact of historical behavior and consequences for peoples and what that has done to First Nations communities across the continent. The dislocation, the deliberate disembowelment of families, etc., have been raised consistently as things that determine Aboriginal realities right now. For the Black community, it hasn't been as much. Slavery, the enslavement of African people, is still seen as this foggy abstraction that has been dealt with a long time ago and is too far gone to have much of an impact now. But if you look at the ways in which many of us see ourselves, define ourselves, embrace tradition, understand our identities, focus on the implications of what that oppressive experience, that traumatic experience have done, you will see that it is still relevant. We're still struggling and working through the legacy of enslavement and colonization, for example. So I would say we still have a task, a huge task ahead of us, and we're not going to get to healing unless we fully contextualize and understand what the past has meant and what it has done to us. Mostly negative, but in some senses, with respect to our resilience, our sense of determination, our deep spirituality, our commitment to protecting and supporting the very best of our communities, both Aboriginal and Black communities. Those have been things that have always been present in our struggle, but we need to acknowledge and understand fully some of the impacts of those traumatic experiences before we can properly move ahead strongly and effectively.
Thank you, Nene. And I've got to be careful what I asked for, because we were asking for more questions and we have a flood of questions coming in, but this is excellent. Please keep them coming in throughout the presentation. We're going to take up your questions closer to the end, but we have a question for you and a poll for you right now. The question that we're going to ask you to reflect on and enter into conversation closer to the end of this session is this question that's been on our screen for a minute now. So what practices or interventions have been effective for you in your work with youth who experience intergenerational trauma? So we're going to focus this question on intergenerational trauma. So just share some practices and interventions. We want to hear from you. So again, that box, that window there is for questions and comments, and we'd love to share them from you. So we also have a poll question that we're going to launch right now, and you should see it pop up on your screen. The question is about prioritizing which of these three options is the first step. So the question reads, what should be our first step towards supporting young people in dealing with intergenerational trauma? So while all these steps may be important, which one should be the first one in dealing with intergenerational trauma? We're going to take a minute just to allow people to respond. Okay, 5 more seconds. Okay, I'm going to close the poll and share the results. And the results are, number one, by 1%, increasing awareness about trauma and its impact. And then people believe that building resources to support trauma resiliency should be a first step. And then a few people here are thinking about addressing the systemic roots of intergenerational trauma as being the first step that needs to happen. So based on this result, Nene, do you have any feedback on what we're seeing here?
Yes, I agree. I didn't think it would be so close, because obviously you need to understand the nature of the challenges and the problems before you can decide how you need to deal with it. But absolutely, increasing awareness and appreciation of the centrality and importance of trauma and its impact is the way to start. Having said that, though, we can't just sit around talking about how awful the past was and how much it affects us. We need to develop the skills, the tools, the capacity, and the resources to respond effectively in supporting individuals, families, and communities through different clinical approaches, through different group peer support approaches, through different community engagement, community capacity building approaches, etc. So they are critical. And of course, the systemic nature of trauma still persists in terms of the kinds of oppressive practices, whether it's policing or in education or criminal justice or child welfare, where those are still triggers for trauma and still very, very profound and significant spaces for oppression that still affect Black and Aboriginal peoples.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to hand the presentation back to you, and we look forward to continuing this great insight that you're offering us.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a bit about some healing approaches, some approaches to wellness that will help communities to heal from this historical and intergenerational trauma. The first, obviously, is to see communities as sites of historical resistance, self-reliance, deep strength, and assets, as opposed to being problems. Second, we have to put families first. The family is the foundation of the community, the foundation of our village, as it were. And what that means is the work with individuals and within families in terms of different approaches that might strengthen the family's capacity and resilience and resourcefulness emotionally and otherwise is really, really critical to building the community. And we need to center Black and Aboriginal culture. Culture is the lifeblood, is the lens through which we build and reinforce our value systems, our worldviews, and our behaviors. And our traditional cultural values have been under attack in many ways, and we need to understand how we use culture in a contemporary way to actually build our strength, rebuild our vitality, reconnect with spirituality, re-engage with all those who have stood up against oppression in the past for the advancement of our interests, and to really value the things, the different systems and approaches that really give meaning to who we are, help to reinforce our identity and our sense of self and our sense of community. And of course, using different forms, multiple forms of appropriate therapies. No one form will work for everyone. I always find that things like narrative therapies, where people actually tell their stories in settings that are safe and supportive, trauma-focused cultural behavioral therapy, CBT, always seems to work well depending on how culturally grounded it is, etc. So different kinds of therapeutic approaches help. Ensuring that the education will focus on understanding and unpacking is important. So the realities of racism, racial terrorism, and oppression needs to be clearly identified. The relevance of culturally grounded anti-oppressive practices, and the specific counseling intervention skills and competencies needed by social work, schools of social work, and faculties of psychiatry, etc. We have to directly address racism, racial terrorism, and oppression as key features of the re-traumatizing realities of communities. So historical trauma isn't frozen and isolated in the past. It is often regenerated, strengthened, and reinforced by contemporary realities of many in our communities. And optimal support towards wellness does not label, diagnose individuals or families as the problem. Creates opportunities for children, teens, and adults to tell their stories of trauma. Empowers families to have control over the kind, type, direction, and amount of help they receive. Uses successful survivors of trauma to guide and support others. Explores, teaches, and practices specific alternative responses and behaviors to future dangers. Promotes recovery group experiences structured to help recipients learn personal responsibility and ways of managing traumatic reactions, of course, grounded in culture and grounded in the lived experiences of the community. Teaches information about intergenerational trauma and its impact. Must not encourage recipients to avoid re-experiencing the trauma. And by that, I mean speaking to, identifying, even experiencing some of the emotional responses to the trauma will help people at times to understand its impact, to learn its nature fully, and to decide together how to move forward in a way that's safe, supportive, effective, and helpful.
Thank you, Nene. So we have a discussion opportunity here. The next slide is going to share a scenario that Nene, maybe you can take us through it, and we'll look out for people's responses to this. And if you can then provide us a walkthrough of different things that we should consider. And as responses to this scenario come in, I'll share them with you.
Okay, so the scenario is many youth who attend your program are extremely afraid of the police or being out in public and are triggered by sudden loud noises, sirens, and men in uniforms. It's having a significant impact on your ability to run your program effectively. In the past 3 weeks or so, 4 young men in the community have been brutalized by the police. There have also been 2 gang-related homicides in that same period of time. Both of these incidents were witnessed by other young people.
Thanks, Nene. Maybe you can start walking us through some of the things that we should consider with this.
Okay. So the first thing is, I think young people need to feel a sense of safety and reassurance. If you are involved in a youth program or a youth initiative, you want to get the young people to feel as if they have a place they could go to talk about how they're feeling, first of all. That is safe, that is reassuring, and that's supportive and respectful. You want to ensure that you have an opportunity to engage with them as peers in a group setting and also individually as they might be dealing with the triggers and traumas of what they've experienced. So it might be that you you have a discussion about how they are reacting to what has happened, how they're feeling, what kind of supports they might need to get them to a place where they feel less threatened, less insecure, less fearful. So it might be that, for example, the engagement with the police is an issue in terms of some proactive things that need to happen to lessen police presence or increase police accountability. A lot of times young people want to see that leaders are actually leading in responding to what's happening in the community and are taking actions to reduce or eliminate the threat or the problems. So having a plan around how you're going to respond strategically to the police presence and having young people help work through that plan is one way of actually helping them see that they have agency, they have capacity, and they have the ability. Now, the fact that many young people experience this in many different communities, I think presents an opportunity for collaboration, for alignment, for building solidarity, etc. That sense of purpose, that sense of cohesion around a common issue, that sense of agency is one effective way of helping young people to actually deal with the trauma. Now, there are things in terms of CBT, for example, that you can do with individuals around how they think through their responses to what they see in terms of the feelings of fear, the way in which they can cope, breathing exercises, visualization exercises, etc., that remind them that they are not the problems, that help to focus them on ways in which they can modulate or control the way their bodies respond to the situation, that helps them to understand what kind of leadership they can provide that might be effective and helpful and supportive, etc., etc. So there are things you can do with the individual young person as well as in a peer setting in groups that help to take them through a process of reassurance, stabilization, support, safety, and moving forward. Moving forward in terms of continuing to build their personal resilience, but also ensuring that something is done about the problems they're seeing and about the inequities that they're facing. So those are just some few things, some few thoughts you might want to keep in mind. I think the key thing is to have a trauma-informed, trauma-resilient approach, which means that your staff should be trained around how to de-escalate, diffuse, reassure, support young people who might be triggered, who might be angry, fearful, uncertain, etc. And to create a safe and supportive environment in which you can unpack, you can help to reassure and clarify, teach them some coping skills, and help to build some things that will give a sense to them that the problems will be addressed. Hello?
Yes, thanks, Nene. So the next slide is going to be the conclusion slide. And you'll be able to kind of just bring a summary of what we've learned, and then we're going to go right into questions. So right now I'm just pulling some questions together that people are asking. There's still time to ask, and we'll go through those right after we just summarize the presentation.
Okay, so intergenerational trauma is a trauma transferred from the first generation of survivors who experienced or witnessed it directly in the past to the second and further generations. The role of emotional regulation, narrative, and symbolic representation are potent factors in the intergenerational transmission of these experiences. So if your parents and grandparents describe and explain and respond to those historically traumatic situations in a particular way, then that's the way in which it's likely to be transmitted to you. Culture, community strength, anti-oppressive clinical practices, centering families on the healing journey, and challenging racism, racial terrorism, and anti-oppression all support effective responses to intergenerational trauma.
Okay, so we have a number of questions, and we're going to be answering them a little bit on the fly, but we have a number that have been queued. And so I want to start with a question that a few people have been asking, and this is around some of the terms that you used earlier on, or concepts rather. Psychic number, wow, the B is silent. Psychic numbing and somatization. On those terms, those concepts, what do they mean? Psychic numbing and somatization.
So psychic numbing is the kind of disassociation emotionally from the experience you're sharing. So where you might have typically become angry or impassioned or really emotional about the experience that you're having, you tend to disconnect. So for example, the rash of police killings of young black men that we've seen over the last while, actually it's not a rash, it's been going on for quite a while, it's just more and more being videotaped and recorded now, but it is being displayed and presented through different forms of media, social media, television, etc., much more graphically and much more persistently. And there are many in the community who, in terms of their own emotional well-being and stability, have decided to actually disengage emotionally from what they're seeing in order to protect themselves, because each experience could be a triggering experience for you. And so for many people, in terms of their own coping, they make a decision to numb themselves psychically from the normal reactions of anger and frustration and fear and determination that might come with seeing yet another example of this kind of traumatizing experience for young people in the community. So the numbing is a way, in many ways, a process of coping and managing through difficult, stressful, traumatizing experiences to protect yourself psychologically. And somatization is simply the way in which your body physically manifests the emotional stress and the emotional fear that you're going through psychologically. So it might result, for example, in upset stomach. It might result in severe headaches. It might result in cancer. Cancer has its roots, for example, in stress, a lot of it. A large percentage of cancer-related illnesses have their roots in stress. So the somatization is the physical manifestation of the deep trauma that people are experiencing psychologically and emotionally.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So some of the questions are similar, so I'm just going to kind of summarizing them into one question. Some questions I will try to read as close to the original composition as possible. This next question, a few people have been asking about the cultural incompetence of the framework of trauma. Can you speak just a little bit more about that?
Okay, so in many communities, we don't even use the word trauma. We talk about the experiences we've had. We talk about what has happened. We talk about the blues. We talk about the terrible legacies that we're still struggling with. We frame it in a way that is more directly related to the experiences we've had. And I guess for me, it is finding the terminology, the right kind of cultural conceptualizing that will make it as relevant culturally to the lived experiences of Aboriginal and Black people as possible. So as I said earlier, the term ma'afa is one term that has been used in our community, and a more prevalent term now is the mengamasi, which has a more deliberate, a more intentional, a more pernicious implication with respect to the trauma of enslavement and colonization as deliberate acts. So it is simply an acknowledgement that these terms we currently use might be incomplete in describing the lived experience, the cultural framing that would do more justice to the specific realities of Aboriginal and Black people. And we, of course, have the right to define ourselves and our experiences. And this is still a work in progress. So, for example, the post-traumatic slavery disorder that we spoke of earlier is one such example of we coming to terms with how we understand and organize our analysis of the experiences that we have shared.
Thank you very much. I want to keep it rolling because we've got a lot of great questions. Earlier in your slide, I believe you mentioned that one of the challenges was in the upbringing or the raising of Black children in terms of a manifestation of intergenerational trauma in the community. So there was a question that reads, could you please explain the relationship between poor parenting and generational trauma and oppression? And to be fair, I'm not sure if you actually used parenting as a direct example. Being, the upbringing of children, you may have included, cultural factors, social factors. So if you want to expand your response to that question, that's fine. But how is, a child or a young person growing up in this society possibly reflecting intergenerational trauma?
Well, in many ways, if your parents have been taught or have experienced or have been told by their parents that we are inferior culturally, we're inferior intellectually, we're inferior physically, we're inferior spiritually, and that is manifested consistently in the ways in which people in your family speak about others in our community who are like us, in the ways in which offhanded comments about what is valuable and what is valued are shared, in the ways in which certain practices are reinforced. So, for example, for many in the Black community, skin shade, skin color, shadism, colorism, is a legacy of that historical trauma, where dark-skinned people, the ones who worked in the fields, for example, were of an inferior social category than those who are lighter skinned, those who might have been of mixed race, heritage, etc. The legacy of that, the insecurity that comes with that, the self-shame that often is associated with dark-skinned Black people is something that still persists. And one of the most vicious insults you could lay on anyone is to call them black and ugly, right? And so those things are transmitted through the ways in which we behave and the ways in which we actually either consciously or unconsciously reinforce the perception of what is good, what isn't so good, what is right, what isn't so right, what is beautiful, what is intelligent, etc., etc. Now, no parent sits around to say, to decide and to plan that they're going to emotionally devastate their child by teaching them that they're inferior. It is things that we do unconsciously most of the times because that is what we've been taught and that is what we know. And many in our communities are actually uncomfortable and hesitant in connecting with things that are culturally grounded in our traditions because we've been told that those things are backward and negative. And as you know, there are many people from the community, both Aboriginal and Black community, who want nothing to do with cultural practices in our community, who say that those things are backward and negative. So I think it is those behaviors that often unconsciously reinforce some perspectives around identity and capacity and so on in children that are the reinforcing the realities of how trauma gets reinforced. And I want to say a few words about the parenting piece. There's a role and a place for personal responsibility, absolutely. And I think in talking about the legacy of trauma, the history of trauma, we don't lose sight of the fact that there is a role for us to be responsible and conscientious and good parents and so on. But I think we also have to understand the cascade of issues and realities that are often arrayed against families, most significantly of which are things like poverty and so on, and everyday racism, that diminish and reduce the capacity of many well-meaning parents to parent in the ways that they know they would want to, or that they are interested in parenting. And some of those things include, for example, the level of depression and serious anxieties in many poor families, the exposure and persistent exposure to violence, violent neighborhoods, violent communities, violent interactions, etc. The loss of fear, the loss of hope that many have, the fearfulness that might come with uncertainty about the future, the psychological stress and strain that comes with negotiating racism and oppressive behaviors all the time, every day. Those contribute to parents not parenting as optimally as they would like. I think all parents want the best for their children. When you have child protective services or the school or the police being involved in ways that might not be as helpful or as supportive, then that could be a problem as well. So I want to make sure we balance the idea of personal responsibility, parental responsibility, with the realities of what many parents deal with and work through. And I must say finally that the focus on spirituality, however you define it, church, mosque, your own spiritual practices, your own cultural practices that have a spiritual foundation, the more connected we are to those practices, the more likely it is that the family is more balanced and more healthy. The research shows that if there's a spiritual focus in the family that's consistent, then it brings a level of stability and certainty to some of the behaviors in the family. Now, you know, there are pros and cons around what exactly that might mean depending on the kind of practices you're engaged with. So I'm just saying generally, it seems to help.
Thanks very much. I'm going to ask you about what we can do practically. I know we've been talking about that throughout the presentation, but this is in the context of somebody that is very new to social justice work, that is new to working with survivors of trauma, somebody that wants everyday practical suggestions. What I'm going to do first, Nene, is just share what some people have been sharing in comments in terms of solutions, and then I'm going to ask that question to you in terms of, so, you know, what are some other things that we can do practically? We also, I should mention that we do have a handouts section that's also a part of that window on the right side of your screen, and we have information there that you can use to access further resources and also make sure that you get the slide to take with you as well. So some of the feedback that we got around solutions, this one reads, working with groups specifically, so the LGBTQ youth, men and women only groups. So I know there's a whole politics about that focus space. So creating space and identifying the systemic barriers that exist and creating conversations on how that's impacting people. Another comment was one word, it said mentorship. And I know that's something that YouthREX is really building a lot of content on the exchange around that particular theme in particular. Also, there's another one that says building resources, and people will have the confidence to understand that their wounds can be healed. So what kind of resources can be built is one part of the question, but again, the other one is, you know, let's put some resources behind our efforts and our ideas so that we can make things happen. Another one is a statement that's reflecting on someone's values. It reads, I do not recreate power imbalances that youth experience at school. I do not speak and treat youth the way authority figures do. I generously listen and provide them this space to share, to be, to learn, and co-create their experiences. So I think that's a really nice sharing of different values in terms of how to approach the work. So Nene, could you suggest any other practical approaches to everyday work with young people, especially for those, and I'll frame it in two ways, those that are brand new to the concepts, and could you also speak to those that have been doing this work for quite a while? And one of the questions here says, how do you avoid being tokenized when you're trying to be culturally specific and sensitive to addressing these issues? So practical things for new interventions and new practices, and also practical things for those of us that have been doing this from time.
Okay, that's a lot packed in there. I think for those who are new, the most important thing I would suggest that you might need to do is to know more about the nature and the scope of trauma in terms of how it impacts particular communities and communities within communities. So someone mentioned earlier the LBGT community, which where trauma might be compounded in terms of homophobia, for example. You know, another might be a religious minority within the community, where isolation and physical attacks and stereotyping and so on might be compounding factors as well. So I think the first thing is to learn as much as you can about the scope and nature of the trauma and the challenges you're talking about, and the specifics with respect to different populations and how that experience, that traumatic experience, is manifested for that or those populations. The second thing I think would be to understand that this process of healing and wellness, that journey, takes time and patience and persistence, and that along the journey you find people who are experienced and balanced in their perspective and who can bring the right combination of righteous anger against a system that's oppressive, along with healing, tranquil energy. So you nurture mind, body, spirit through different practices. Something as simple as diet, in terms of cutting down how much sugar and starch we need, can reduce the impact of your triggering, for example. The way we breathe, the kinds of visualization activities we might do that can center our energy, to focus more on, for example, our chakras, to focus more on the ways in which we come to balance and tranquility in our responses to things that are traumatic or stressful or negative. So those are self-managing things that we can learn that can help along the journey. But the most important thing is to have as much knowledge and information as possible, not to become an expert on someone else's reality, but to have enough context so you can have an engagement and a practice that is as informed and as contextualized as possible, so you can be as useful and as helpful as possible. The other thing I think is just your analysis around social justice, anti-oppression, etc., and how that analysis helps to frame and shape the way you step into this work. So understanding what it means to be a social justice advocate, that a youth worker is not simply someone who builds a program or opens a gym or has an employment session with a young person or is engaged in some case management work, right? You have to build a transformational ethic, in my mind, around how you engage young people so they realize they have agency and they can move from being victims of oppression to actually providing the kind of impactful leadership, peer leadership, that could help to address oppressive behaviors, oppressive conditions in a healthy and positive and constructive way. In terms of those who've been doing the work for a while, I think one of the key things we miss, well, two things. One is, I don't think we are as collaborative as we need to be across different domains. So for example, there are groups doing all kinds of work in different areas. There are young people who are focusing, for example, on substance misuse, on addictive behaviors. There are young people who are focusing on sexual identity. There are young people who are focusing on employment issues. There are young people who are focusing on immigration, adaptation, and settlement because they're newcomers. There are young people who are focused on dealing with the divide in the Muslim community with respect to those who are more newly arrived and those who have been here for a while. So we have a whole range of young people who are often focused on very specific issues, but all of those issues having trauma, historical and contemporary trauma, as an important part of them. I think the extent to which we can collaborate and share and plan and build to create critical mass, to create a better alignment and a more intentional commitment to addressing these issues broadly, I think the extent to which we can do that in terms of leadership that is strategic and timely, I think that will make a big difference in how we advance these issues in the sector. For example, should we have a Truth and Reconciliation Council or committee just based on youth issues, on the kinds of things that traumatize young people in our city? Should there be some province-wide or nationwide initiative that really goes to the heart of what's happening with young people in terms of trauma? And what does that mean in terms of how systems respond, how communities respond, how young people respond and organize? And is our commitment as a society as comprehensive, as visionary as it needs to be in addressing trauma? Or is it piecemeal and reactive? You know, so those are just some thoughts.
Thank you. I've got some shorter questions I want to splice in here. So this question is interesting. What is the difference between ghettos and NIA neighborhoods, neighborhood improvement areas?
I'm not sure what an NIA is.
An NIA is identified as it's probably like a priority neighborhood or a neighborhood improvement area. So this question, I know it's political, it's provocative, but let's throw it out there. Let's have the conversation. What are your thoughts, Nene?
In terms of the terminology itself, ghetto implies a space that is utterly hopeless, that is bereft of any redeeming quality, that is violence prone, that is teeming with drugs and poverty, and that is utterly irredeemable. There are many ways to describe the places where Aboriginal and Black peoples live, but ghetto wouldn't be one of the terms I would use. Many of those same neighborhoods have very effective, innovative programming, have amazing leadership, young people, have all kinds of potential, have incredible experiences of resilience and determination and strength, and have a lot of assets that are yet to be exploited positively and properly. Those neighborhoods are created generally by a confluence of factors. The way social housing has been constructed, where you have high density, population density in smaller, crowded areas, which increase the likelihood of infectious diseases, increase the likelihood of violent behavior, increase the likelihood of difficulty and challenges simply by physical spacing. That is the reality of many of these neighborhoods. Additionally, where you have a lot of low-income people, you're going to attract some kinds of antisocial behaviors around those areas. What that means as well, especially when those areas are neglected in terms of building maintenance, road maintenance, adequate green spaces, adequate support services and resources and so on, it tends to create the kinds of conditions that might produce more violence, more problems and more challenges in some of these neighborhoods and some of these communities. So those areas don't become the way they are simply because people are, you know, poor and racialized, and by virtue of being poor and racialized, we draw the conclusion that they're irresponsible and criminal. They're developed by a series of factors that lead, that together conspire to create the conditions where people end up being oppressed. So that would be my answer to it. So I'm not sure how politically loaded the question was, but certainly low-income neighborhoods exist in a particular way, and that has happened for particular reasons. Another quick example: low-income neighborhoods have limited access to fresh, healthy food, have limited access to supermarkets, for example, have limited access to choices in terms of healthcare supports, have more limited access to other kinds of resources, and there's all kinds of work done by Toronto Public Health that shows spatially and visually where some of those amenities are in relation to the income level of certain communities. And the lowest income levels have the worst connection to some of those amenities. So it is not surprising that some of these neighborhoods are the way they are.
Thank you. So this webinar will go till 11:30, so we still have a few minutes left. Another question that stood out here, it's interesting. Do you feel that the removal of statues of controversial historical figures fixes anything regarding intergenerational trauma?
I'm not sure. Maybe. If I were driving by a statue of someone who slaughtered my foreparents, that might be a re-triggering experience for me. That might be a re-traumatizing experience for me. If I am driving by that statue and I have no knowledge or no awareness of who this person is, because I just didn't know, I didn't read, I don't understand, I've never took the time to actually go and read the inscription on the statue to find out who it was, then it's just another guy on a horse or another guy standing there, another white male standing there. So I think part of it comes with awareness around what reinforces your sense of vulnerability and fear, which is trauma, and what doesn't. And that awareness and consciousness is a part of it. It's also a part of your healing. The more aware you are, the more understanding you are of how your body and your mind and your spirit might be reacting to the thing that's triggering you. And then the more capable you are of thinking through how you're going to manage those triggers and deal with that trauma. So I guess the short answer to your question is it depends. It depends a lot on awareness. Political awareness, personal awareness, social awareness.
Okay, thank you. Two sets of questions that are dealing with a similar theme. Given the amount of Black and Indigenous staff working within oppressive systems, how does one continue to challenge and eradicate racism when many racialized staff have internalized colonial mentalities? I'm going to save the next one until this one's done.
Okay. Yeah, that's a common reality. I think you just continue to do the work. Many of those individuals have made a conscious decision around coping, have probably made a conscious decision around paying the mortgage, have made a conscious decision around understanding their particular workplace and its politics, and what survival for them might mean in that context. I would caution an indictment, a full sweeping indictment. And I would say there are many in those spaces who would be open to the right kind of engagement around helping them to affirm their identity and build their sense of determination, and also build a kind of solidarity with others in those spaces that could help them to reclaim who they are, assert who they are, and move forward positively in those spaces. So the idea of self-hate, the concept of self-hate is real and applicable in many instances, but I would just caution against writing off all those who do not take part in the rally or the demonstration as, you know, self-hating. I think we need to get to know people's situation and their thinking, and understand what might be possible in terms of allyship and partnership and collaboration, and working with folks in terms of helping them on their journey. Because many of them, of course, will experience racial oppression in those spaces as well, and have chosen how they want to deal with it in terms of their own professional survival. So the more we have people who are willing to work in solidarity and stand up together, I think the more inclined more people might be to actually get involved. Where those spaces aren't available, where there's isolation and fear, many folks tend to simply work on, you know, just getting the job done and keeping quiet. So it depends. So I guess I'm just saying I would caution against sweeping indictments.
Thank you. Another question reads, how do we focus on supporting youth while also recognizing the same trauma that the youth workers, teachers, and other community members are also facing?
Yeah, so vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, internalization, those are all things that youth workers and those who work with people who work with youth need to be mindful of in terms of their own healing and wellness. You can't help someone to get well if you are profoundly unwell. So your own triggers, your own awareness, self-awareness of being burnt out or being stressed out or being emotionally fragile because of your exposure to repeated experiences of trauma and stressful situations with young people, means you have to monitor and assess carefully how you're going to engage and when you need to step back and recharge and rejuvenate and rest, and what that might mean for you. And understanding how you yourself sometimes might take on the traumatic experiences of young people because of your persistent exposure to those experiences. And so you develop your self-care for yourself in terms of your physical health, your emotional health, and your spiritual health. In terms of your workplace, the safety of your workplace, in promoting a trauma-informed space that is healthy and responsive to the needs of staff, in terms of mental health days, in terms of workload decision-making, in terms of programming focus, in terms of collegial support, in terms of all of those things, I think go towards you optimally being able to work with young people who are traumatized, and at the same time being mindful of your own situation and doing something about it.
Thank you. Do you have anything to say about a possible connection between intergenerational trauma and genetics?
You know, there's research that says, for example, that the proclivity towards high blood pressure in many African and indigenous communities is actually a direct result of the historical trauma they've been exposed to repeatedly, and that has resulted in a kind of genetic mutation. The gene for hypertension is much more prevalent in those who have been exposed to those kinds of traumas historically, generationally. I'm not sure how scientifically plausible that is. I'm not a geneticist, but it is certainly a theory that has been expounded for quite some time in terms of the health manifestations we see in those communities. I think the level of anxiety, the level of caution, the level of distrust and fearfulness that often accompany how we deal with authority figures, for example, in our community. Some might say that now has a genetic basis because it's been built into our DNA for responsiveness, our sense of survival, or instincts for protection, and so on, based on our lived experience and based on our histories. Again, I don't know scientifically how much of that can be proven, but I do know that those are things that we instinctively engage in. When someone comes to my door because they're doing some research or some polling, I got to think about what happened to Black people and some of those secret experiments. I got to think about whether I really want to give this person any personal information, because I'm not sure what the state will do with it, because I have so many examples of how the state has actually abused its power in this regard with respect to our communities. Those are instinctive things that come up in me. Now, are those genetic? Are those learned behaviors? Are those, I don't know where to draw the line, but they're real. That's what I know. So I can't say definitively how genetically predisposed we are to certain traumatic stressors, or how much of that is simply passed down generationally and we internalize it and behave appropriately.
Thank you. We have a few minutes left. I want to reflect some of the solutions that some of us have shared, and I'll just read verbatim. So one respondent says, reconnecting First Nations youth with their cultural roots, teaching from elders. There was also a comment that was saying that we need another webinar. We need to expand these conversations that can focus on voices from Indigenous communities as well. So kind of combining those comments. There's another comment here, using transparency, honesty, and the example they provide. When I have to write clinical notes, I do it collaboratively with the client, and hopefully clear that I'm speaking right now, apologies. But they work collaboratively with their client to review the notes and make sure that the things that they're recording are agreed to by both parties. Another person here says to acknowledge the young person's discomfort, to make space for unpacking the process and the things that they are, in terms of the work, are becoming aware of, make space to unpack that, to reflect, using music, arts, sports, community meals, to invite and expedite the healing process, encouraging young people to discover their identity, to build on their personal and community strengths, teaching leadership skills, holistic wellness strategies, and gaining confidence in the healing journey, using photo voice, using alternative methods. So Nene, there was a question, and I'm hoping that those suggestions are helpful for people hearing them now, and I'm sorry that we can't get to everything. But one question, Nene, was about alternative options to healing. Can you speak a little bit about approaching healing in alternative ways?
I don't like the term alternative because it implies that you have the mainstream authority, which is the valid and legitimate way, and then you have some other offshoots which are still, experimental or vague or kind of, hocus pocus sort of thing, as opposed to them having validity in their own right. So I would say complementary would be the term I would use. That the approaches to healing and wellness in terms of trauma from a cultural perspective, from a complementary perspective, are many, and some of them you have listed out in the recommendations that people talk about. Spirituality, meditation, herbal supports. You could do meditation with the different chakras, for example, if you're into that stuff. Different kinds of therapies around breathing, as I mentioned earlier, around visualization, around working with colors, around sound therapy and drum therapy and dance therapy, around different kinds of narrative therapies you might do, focusing on certain critical issues from a cultural perspective. There are many things that I think over thousands of years our communities have practiced and have shown to be effective and impactful in a positive way for people's healing. And the best evidence is in the outcome and in the impact. And I'm not saying this to say that research, evidence-based work is not important, but evidence is also contextual and is also subjective, And our evidence is hundreds and hundreds of years of practice and outcomes that show people heal and people doing better. That's our evidence. That's our traditional evidence. So we have to value that. And I think we have to go back to those ways that are legitimate and credible in our communities to find our own journeys and our own path towards healing and wellness.
Thank you, Nene. That was incredible and insightful. And in terms of just having a connection with an understanding of where we are, even from a personal level. So the idea of mentorship was mentioning, and I'll do a very quick plug that there is a call out right now from the Ministry of Child and Youth Services with the Black Youth Action Plan for Ontario, a call out for mentorship programs right now. So we can take some of this information and apply it to how we can know better in doing our work and trying to be as effective as we can while also being critical of those dominant forms. So thank you for that critique as well on the alternative. Nene, I would just like to hand it over to you for the last few minutes just for some concluding words, and then we'll wrap up with some housekeeping.
Thanks. I guess my prevailing thought is ensuring that we nurture and cultivate and support the genius of young people. And that we do that in a way that's safe and respectful and healthy, and that we work with young people on this journey, this joint journey towards wellness and wholeness in a way that understands and respects their lived experience, and in a way that utilizes the very best of our traditions and our cultures, and in a way that sees those traditions and cultures as legitimate and appropriate, and that we, on this journey, we recognize that it has taken hundreds of years of struggle and pain and suffering, but also of resistance and reliance, resilience and determination, and that we are here because many of us refused to give up, refused to simply roll over, refused to accede to the prevailing powers, refused to be discouraged, and refused to be defeated. And so it is that legacy of determination that we draw on, that we call on in working with young people. It is that framing that helps them to see possibilities, that helps them to focus powerfully on what is potentially available for us in terms of this journey towards healing, and that we do so with the kind of clarity and self-assurance and determination that really models the very best of our communities, the very best of our young people, that we don't see them as problems, we see them as dealing with struggling through, heroically trying to manage problems that have been foisted on them, mostly by a system that is oppressive. And so our healing, winning ways, I think, have to take these things into account. And we do it with kindness and love and clarity and strength and respect for the voices, the lived experience, the perspectives, and the energies of our young people. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nene. Thanks for your insights. This brings us to 11:30, and we want to honor the time of the people that are doing great work supporting young people and community in the field. So we'll end the conversation here, knowing that this conversation will most definitely continue. We do have resources available in the handout section. You can download the PowerPoint slides, more information on this webinar, including the bio for Nene, as well as a resource list that includes a number of websites that you can get more practical insight from for addressing challenges in trauma in our practice. We will be providing the spelling of some of the key terms that were mentioned in this webinar, so look out for that. The webinar, again, was recorded, and you will be able to review it and share it. So please make sure that you're signed up on the YouthREX email list. If you're not, go to youthrex.com, and instructions for signing up will be there. Thank you so much for joining us. Bye for now.